Hello, I'm delighted to be joining you today for this important meeting. I wish I were in New Zealand in person. I very much enjoy your country and wish I could be there, but it's nice to have the opportunity to do this remotely. I'd like to talk today about harnessing science to reduce sugar-sweetened beverage consumption. No need to explain why it's important to reduce sugar-sweetened beverage consumption to an audience like this. So I'd like to address the issue in this way. This would be my agenda for today. First, to make an argument of why to focus on sugar-sweetened beverages as an initial step in addressing obesity, why taxes can be a very effective strategy, and then to bring in a model of strategic science, which really helps address the issue of how do we harness science in order to create more social change, in this case, reduction of sugar-sweetened beverage consumption. There are a number of reasons to focus on sugar-sweetened beverages as a public health target. These will be familiar to you, so I won't dwell on these in any detail, with the exception of two parts here. One would be the poor calorie compensation and the fact that sugar may be addictive. So this is not so well known about the poor calorie compensation issue, but there's actually very interesting research showing that the body doesn't seem to register calories or recognize calories as well when they get delivered in liquid form as compared to solid foods. So for example, if one eats a meal and overdoes it by a certain number of calories, but the calories are delivered in liquid form as opposed to a solid food that could be pizza, donuts, or ice cream for that matter, the body won't recognize the liquid calories as well, and therefore people don't compensate. And of concern are the trends in many parts of the world showing that people are consuming a higher percentage of their calories in beverages than what used to be the case. So the poor calorie compensation becomes Hello, I'm delighted to be joining you today for this important meeting. I wish I were in New Zealand in person. I very much enjoy your country and wish I could be there, but it's nice to have the opportunity to do this remotely. I'd like to talk today about harnessing science to reduce sugar-sweetened beverage consumption. No need to explain why it's important to reduce sugar-sweetened beverage consumption to an audience like this. So I'd like to address the issue in this way. This would be my agenda for today. First, to make an argument of why to focus on sugar-sweetened beverages as an initial step in addressing obesity, why taxes can be a very effective strategy, and then to bring in a model of strategic science, which really helps address the issue of how do we harness science in order to create more social change, in this case, reduction of sugar-sweetened beverage consumption. There are a number of reasons to focus on sugar-sweetened beverages as a public health target. These will be familiar to you, so I won't dwell on these in any detail, with the exception of two parts here. One would be the poor calorie compensation and the fact that sugar may be addictive. So this is not so well known about the poor calorie compensation issue, but there's actually very interesting research showing that the body doesn't seem to register calories or recognize calories as well when they get delivered in liquid form as compared to solid foods. So for example, if one eats a meal and overdoes it by a certain number of calories, but the calories are delivered in liquid form as opposed to a solid food that could be pizza, donuts, or ice cream for that matter, the body won't recognize the liquid calories as well, and therefore people don't compensate. And of concern are the trends in many parts of the world showing that people are consuming a higher percentage of their calories in beverages than what used to be the case. So the poor calorie compensation becomes a very real issue. The issue of addiction is interesting, relatively new on the scene. The science is still building, but the way I read the science, it's pretty robust and interesting to consider in this context. One might think of it as this. This is the coca leaf in its natural form, and in its natural form, people tend not to abuse it, and humans can live in harmony with it. But when it gets processed into cocaine or hyper-processed into crack cocaine, humans act from imposing a tax. There's very low cost in doing it. You're not having to educate the public, for example, one by one. Considerable revenue can be generated. I'll come back to this in a few moments. And this becomes an important part of the potential framing in order to sell the tax to the public. And the evaluations thus far have been quite positive. There are counter-arguments to the tax. The chief one used by the industry is that it could be a regressive tax, that is, it would unfairly hurt people in the poorest parts of society. However, obesity and diabetes are highly regressive diseases, and it's very important to know that a tax might help offset that, much as a tobacco tax did. The companies cry foul and say that it's a discriminatory tax, that there are lots of foods contributing to obesity, which is absolutely the case. Nobody that I know of would say that sugar-sweetened beverages are the only contributor to obesity, or that they're the only foods that need to change in the dietary picture of countries around the world. But one has to start somewhere, and the place to start would be where the science is the strongest, showing that a certain category of foods is related to risk for things like obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. And that science does exist in the case of sugar-sweetened beverages, less so with other categories of food. They make the argument that taxing sugar-sweetened beverages will not get rid of the obesity problem. Well, of course, that's a straw man argument. Nobody would say that it does, and that it would all by itself. And of course, it needs to be a part of a portfolio of strategies that would help reduce sugar-sweetened beverage consumption. And the other argument the companies make is that there's a slippery slope, that once you start with sugar-sweetened beverages, where will you go next? Well, of course it's a slippery slope. What you hope is that the tax will prove effective in improving public health, but then there might be other categories of foods that could be added as well. So I don't find the counterarguments particularly compelling, and I find each one of them relatively easy to disarm. The structure of taxes that most people are considering are an excise tax as opposed to a sales tax. This would not encourage people to buy larger containers of food, and it would also be the case that the tax increase would show up on the shelf when people buy the product rather than at the cash register, as would be the case with a sales tax. The level of tax that's being discussed most often is a minimum of 1 penny per ounce of any beverage with added sugar. Higher taxes have been passed in some places and are virtuous for sure. But we don't support taxes less than 1 penny an ounce, although the Mexico tax that I'll talk about in a minute was less than this, about half of this, and did produce a significant change in consumption of the sugar-sweetened beverages. And also there are ways to designate the revenue that can help with public support of these particular taxes. Such taxes have been passed now in a number of places around the world. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's interesting to see the diversity in countries and cities where these taxes have been passed. And there are discussions about such taxes in a number of other places. But entire countries have passed the taxes. Others are considering it. You see some of them on the list. And there are now some evaluations that have been done that show positive results. Here's an example of one from a group of investigators from the University of North Carolina and from Mexico testing the impact of the Mexican sugar-sweetened beverage tax. They found increased water consumption, decreased consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. And I find this especially impressive because the rate of the tax increase was only about 10%. And the recommendation of a 1 penny per ounce tax on sugar-sweetened beverages would raise prices by about 20%. So this is only about half the size, as I mentioned before, of the tax that we think would have a noticeable impact on consumption, and this did have an impact on consumption. I was a bit surprised but delighted to see this and find that this information is highly valuable as we think about taxes in other countries. Berkeley, California was the first city in the United States to pass a sizable tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, a 1 penny per ounce tax. And a paper was just published by Jennifer Falvey and her colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley, showing a positive impact on this. So thus far, the impact of taxes seems to be quite positive and has been shown in quite different set of circumstances in Mexico and Berkeley. Philadelphia has enacted a soda tax in the United States, and evaluations of that tax are underway, and then there are evaluations elsewhere in the world. And as the data come in, we'll have a more robust sense of what impact the taxes have on consumption, what they might do to water consumption, what the revenues get used for, and the like. So I'd like to turn my attention now to the idea of harnessing science to create social change. I assume a number of you in the audience are scientists. I certainly am. And I'd like to describe a frustrating problem that I faced and my colleagues have faced and what we've chosen to do about it, particularly in the context of sugar-sweetened beverage research and taxes in particular. The frustration that I have experienced over the course of my career is that research tends to reach pretty small audiences. I mean, sometimes it can be alarmingly small, 3 or 4 other people in the world who care about the particular work that you do. Some people have bigger audiences, but they're not huge for sure. The research misses key audiences very often, those key audiences being people like policymakers, and that leads to poor links between scholarship and policy. And many scientists are aware of this gap and are frustrated by it, but we're not really trained on what to do about it. So we've thought a lot about this in our own work and have come up with a model that we hope helps address this frustration. One of the problems that we face generally is that when there's not much uptake of science out there into the real world of policymaking, we tend to blame it on the policymakers. That is, we think that they're antagonistic to science. They just don't care about it. They care, but they don't bother to pay attention. And once in a while, we'll turn the attention inside a little bit, and we'll say that, well, we're not good at getting the word out. So our solution to that is let's have more press releases, and let's lob more information over the fence, and hoping somebody on the other side might catch it. But we're not particularly good at that, and it's an imperfect process, to be sure. So we've thought about how we might help address this. But again, the frustration is that the world of policymaking tends to move very fast, and science tends to move pretty slow. So let's just say, for the sake of humorous discussion, that we're setting out to make science as least relevant to the real world as possible. Well, what would we do if that were our goal? Well, we'd make it very slow. It would take a long time to get money to do a project. It would take a long time to roll out the project. It would take forever to get it published. We would poorly communicate it. That is, we would only communicate with other scientists and not the people who are in a position to do something about the problem. It would be unresponsive to the real world issues because we're only doing what other scientists tend to think are important issues, a la programmatic science. So it would become programmatic only and not strategic, and there would be conflicts of interest. That is, many people in the field would be taking money from an affected industry, in this case the beverage companies, and then producing science that favors the beverage companies. Well, and then I forgot, I had this last bullet point, that we would create this indecipherable jargon that we use to communicate with the real world and make it even harder for people to understand what we do. Well, all of these things are what we in fact do as a field. And if we do these things, then we can't be very surprised that the science doesn't have uptake among policymakers. So if we think about what we hope to accomplish generally with our research, most researchers, I believe, hope that there is good, social good that comes from their work. And I think we're pretty good at communicating with other scientists, but we're not very good at communicating with the policy world. So how might one go about changing that? Well, first we have to appreciate that there needs to be links. So the metaphor that I use here is a relay race. So you can think of a relay team needs to pass the baton successfully from one person to another in order for the race to be won. And if you drop the baton, you're disqualified and you've failed in your attempt to win the race. When we do science, we hope that somebody picks up the baton at the other side, that somebody will be reading our work, will hear about it, will take it and place it into action, and that might create policy change. But that's wishful thinking because it doesn't often happen that way. And unless we're trained on how to pass that baton, and unless we realize who we need to pass it to, we're going to have an imperfect process and not have the impact we might on public policy. So this is an issue we've really tried to address. So we've thought about making our research matter by thinking about what's in that middle box, what has to happen in order for social and policy change to occur. And this is the way we've thought about it in a model that we call strategic science. We think about who are the change agents that might be in a position to create the social and policy change from our work. Very rarely is it other scientists, and those are the people we most effectively communicate with. But in the case of obesity, it could be elected leaders, would be an obvious group of people. people that run regulatory agencies, the agriculture commissions of a country, the food and drug administrators, people like that can be very important and powerful in the sense. The courts can be important. The press can be important in changing public opinion. The public itself can help put pressure on legislators to make changes. NGOs, of course, are an important group, and then industry can be an important group. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but an example of some of the things that might be done. So I'd like to give you several examples using sugar-sweetened beverage taxes to show what I mean by this strategic science model. So it begins with this process of identifying the change agents. If you want to enact a certain policy or to create a certain type of social change, we can ask ourselves, who are the people or the institutions out there that might do something about this problem? It could be the courts, as I said before, legislators, the press. It depends on the problem, of course. But once you identify those change agents, that can help you develop strategic questions. Never do I meet with a legislator or a potential change agent, an attorney general, for example, where I don't ask what sort of information would be helpful for you to move ahead with what you're attempting to do. And they don't come up with ideas for studies and research designs, of course, but they come up with ideas of information gaps that we can help address in our research. That leads to research or scholarship. We then can communicate this effectively to the scientific world through peer-reviewed journals, but most importantly, back to the change agents so they have the information that they need in order to move ahead. So this is a model that we've been working with for some time and have had some success with it. And we've written about this, Christina Roberto and I wrote about this in a paper published in 2015 in The Lancet. And if any of you are interested, just send me an email and I'd be happy to send you a copy of this paper. It's a brief paper, but it outlines the model that I've just described. So let's talk about how this applies into the world of sugar-sweetened beverages. We've written a number of scientific articles on sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, but we decided to do several things that we thought would get more attention and become more public. And so with the health commissioner, the person who was the health commissioner of New York at the time, Thomas Frieden, he's now the head of our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States, I wrote this piece on making a public policy case for sugar-sweetened beverage taxes. And because it was in a high-profile journal and because we had a communications group working with us, we were able to get a lot of attention for this. And it got the idea of taxes out there much more than the previously published scientific papers had been able to accomplish. Later that same year, this was in 2009, another group of individuals and I published a paper in the same journal making a public health and economic case for taxing sugar-sweetened beverages. So we talked about how sugar-sweetened beverages were contributing to disease, how a tax might affect consumption, but also we made the economic case by talking about externalities, how people not affected by with a transaction between buyer and seller of sugar-sweetened beverages were affected by it. Namely, the population is paying through public health costs for obesity and diabetes that you may not have yourself, but you're having to pay for. And then there's some other economic arguments as well. So this got more attention and helped, in addition to the earlier piece, get attention out about sugar-sweetened beverage consumption. But then we started doing research on the topic. This was when I was at Yale University and the Rudd Center that I directed at the time. Tanya Andreeva, an economist working with us, did outstanding work, and this paper in particular was really quite impressive. She did a work on price elasticity of soda consumption, and what she did here was looked at how much price change would have to occur in order for consumption to notably decrease of sugar-sweetened beverages. So she worked that all out. That's where we came up with 1 penny an ounce for any beverage with added sugar. So this was a very helpful economic piece published in a good journal, but then publicized by us once it came out, so policymakers knew about it. Tanya also did a wonderful paper on looking at the revenue generation potential of such taxes so that there would be a scientific basis for projecting the revenue that could be generated if a tax were put in place in various parts of the country. These got turned into policy reports by the Rudd Center. These still exist and have been updated by the Rudd Center now at the University of Connecticut. And very impressive work has been done there. What became extremely helpful was this, an interactive calculator that the Rudd Center created that would estimate how much revenue could be generated by a certain level of tax in every major city and state in the United States. So you could go in this calculator, put in the state of California or New York or North Carolina where I live, and so you could go into the calculator and estimate how much revenue could be generated by taxes of a certain level in any major city or state in the United States. And it would come up with something like this, just using the state of California as an example, that it would estimate the amount of consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, and then the number on the bottom right is the total revenue calculation. So the state of California would raise more than $1 billion a year with a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages of 1 penny per ounce. This catches the attention of the legislators, and of course people who may want to use the revenue for certain purposes then know how much it could potentially raise. So this became a bit of strategic science, looking at the tax elasticity of soda and then looking at the revenue generation potential that through this interactive website was made public and could connect directly with the legislators. So we found these sort of things extremely helpful in helping move ahead sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, at least in the United States. There are a number of interesting strategic questions, and I'd like to end with this particular slide. That still might be done, and maybe some of you in the audience would be interested in doing some of these questions. But I think these things could have big impact. To help address the issue of whether the tax is regressive, it would be very interesting, and some of the initial evaluations that I mentioned earlier have started to do this. It would be very interesting to look at the impact on different demographic groups, especially people in underserved populations and people of poor economic means, to see what the impact of taxes is. And does it actually eat into the discretionary amount of money that people have available? Do they continue buying the same amount of sugar-sweetened beverages and therefore just have to pay more? Do they actually reduce their consumption? Do they switch to other beverages? And then what happens to their weight and health as a consequence? It'd be very important to work that out. Another very interesting issue is how to best frame the sugar-sweetened beverage taxes in order to generate maximum public support. And the city of Philadelphia is an interesting case study in this respect. The previous mayor of Philadelphia attempted to put forward a soda tax and came pretty close to getting it passed, but wasn't quite successful. He focused on the health benefits of a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages. He talked a lot about childhood obesity and about the virtues of a tax and how it might lower the health burden on the citizens of Philadelphia. A new mayor got elected and pushed forward on a soda tax as well, but instead of focusing on the health benefits, he focused on the use of the revenue to fund early childhood education programs and spoke very little about obesity, diabetes, and the health consequences of the sugar-sweetened beverage consumption. And he was able to get the tax passed. He started off at 3 pennies per ounce on any beverage of added sugar, which was triple the size that we had recommended as the minimum amount. He ended up compromising at 1.5 pennies per ounce of sugar-sweetened beverage tax, which is terrific because it's still 50% higher than what we recommended initially. But the moral of the story is they got it passed because he focused on the revenue. Now, it's possible that he could have continued to focus on the health frame of this that the previous mayor had started, and he might have gotten it passed. But it's a very interesting and quite testable question in any jurisdiction what the optimal frame is. And it's not too hard to do framing experiments to test different ways of framing the tax argument with different populations to see what might work best in a particular location. And then if the revenue generation is the approach that one chooses, then it would be very helpful to find out what the optimal use of the revenue might be. In some cases, people have spoken about building parks and opportunities for the population to be physically active. In the case of Philadelphia, as I mentioned, it was early childhood education. So there are going to be local favorites, I'm imagining, for the best use of the revenue, and these things can be readily tested. So these would be very important strategic research questions that might be addressed. So I'll just end by summing up and saying that I'm happy to join you. I'm delighted that the conference is occurring in New Zealand. Some very important work is going on in that part of the world. Some outstanding scientists and people I know very well are working on this. I take my hat off to Gerhard for organizing this conference, and to Boyd Swinburne and colleagues for doing such outstanding work in New Zealand and in Australia as well. And I very much look forward to collaborating and connecting with all of you. Good luck with your work, and again, I'm very happy to have joined you today.
Hi, Kelly. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, we've just been, you can't see me, I'm standing behind the lectern, but Gerhard is crouching. You can see him on the camera and raising his arm. We've just been listening to you, and we're really, with rapt attention. It was really thrilling, and we thought we might take this opportunity just to maybe have a couple of questions and answers. Would you be up for that?
I'm very happy. The only thing that would make me happier if I were there in your country, seeing you in person.
We would be able to see you too. Fantastic. Well, if I can pass it over to the audience, do we have any questions from anybody from the audience for Kelly? We do have one. Fantastic.
Yeah, hi. You've talked a little bit about revenue and what might be done with it from taxation. Would you like to make some comment on perhaps the value of a progressive tax as we have with tobacco, where the ultimate goal is no revenue, but an effective implementation of that policy?
Thank you for the excellent question. An ideal tax would eventually lead to the great diminishment in consumption of the product. With tobacco, the goal would be zero. I'm not sure we could establish that for sugared sweetened beverages, but certainly a great reduction would be in order. A progressive tax that rose with time would probably not be doable in the United States given the political situation now, but it could happen in effect, because with tobacco, at least in our country, small taxes began the story, but certainly didn't end the story. And it's quite possible that taxes could ramp up with time in order to offset declining consumption in a way that kept revenue stable. And if the revenue were being used for a suitable purpose, let's say subsidizing the sale of fruits and vegetables, then you'd want that revenue to stay stable at least.
Fantastic, thank you. Do we have another question for Kelly? Yes, we have. Brilliant. Okay, this is Jeff Simmons. This is an economist, interestingly enough. Kelly?
Kia ora, Kelly. There's been a bit of comment in New Zealand lately about the impact of downsizing as a result of sugar sweetened beverage taxes, i.e. shifting down to budget brands. Are you aware of any studies on that impact in America or Mexico?
I don't know that the analyses in America or Mexico have addressed that question in enough detail for us to know the answer. But it's a very good question. It certainly could happen. People would pay less per ounce for the beverage, not less per ounce for the tax, if it were an excise tax. So the tax would remain the same and perhaps provide the same disincentive. If it were a sales tax, then shifting to a lower price version of the same product would certainly have the kind of effect you mentioned. Very good question.
That's great. Do we have time for one last question?
Okay. You mentioned identifying key audiences and trying to answer the questions. I wondered, in relation to sugary drinks and the role of industry, what those engagement and the questions to address for them would be.
Well, the key audiences depend on which part of the picture you're talking about. If the audiences are the legislators or others who may be able to enact tax, then there are certain scientific studies that could be helpful to them. Engagement with the industry is a very interesting issue here. And in fact, I had a discussion recently with some industry officials who were complaining. They've complained bitterly about the tax overall, as you might suspect. But the most recent issue that came up from the industry players were whether the tax, a tax that was graded on the amount of sugar rather than just a threshold, that if you had any sugar at all, you were going to get taxed, might be an incentive for them to reformulate their products to have less sugar, which I think is a completely viable point of view, and it would be interesting to talk about that. We've been thinking about convening a meeting of industry and public health players to talk that through. It would lead to all sorts of interesting questions about where the lines would shift from one level of tax to another, depending on how much sugar, of course, and whether it would really provide that incentive for the industry, we don't know, and what the impact on consumers ultimately would be of a graded tax versus an absolute threshold tax. And I don't know that we have any data to help address that. It would be really interesting if some country or some city passed a graded tax, and then one could collect the data and see how the two taxes compared to one another. Well, thank you for the good question.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Kelly. We really appreciate your fascinating speech and also your insightful answers. Could I please ask the audience to show your appreciation one more time?
Thanks very much, Kelly.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Have a good night.